the normal one, the Kaiser, my manager, Jurgen Norbert Klopp. Hello, lovely people. It is Wednesday, the 15th of May, and this is Professor Matt, and I'm here on the Too Many Guys soccer show with a retrospective of the Jurgen Klopp era at Liverpool. I figured, being that we're probably not going to be recording an episode before the final week of the season, and when we do kick back, I imagine it's going to be all Euros, all Copa de America, all the time. Uh, Somebody had to do something and, have their say about the club era, which is coming to a close this Sunday at Anfield against Wolves. So why not me? So what I'm going to do is talk sort of broadly about the club era. This is not going to be a quote unquote love in, right? Because those of you who have listened or watched the pod over the years know, as much as I love Klopp and as much as he's been the best Liverpool manager in my, you know, quote unquote lifetime, or at least me being cognizant and rooting for the club. Uh, I there are warts, and we'll address those warts. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, the club era in general. Talk about the positives, and there are a lot. We'll talk also about the negatives, which, there are some of those too. And then my hope is to place Klopp and his legacy within a context, not just for Liverpool, but in terms of the Premier League era more generally. Where does he fall in that pantheon of, not just Liverpool managers, but also Premier League era managers? So let's take a trip back, and being an historian, that's what I always do, to October 2015. I'm teaching a global Civ or World Civ 1 course at Delaware County Community College, and I had a student who is a dear, dear friend. And if they're listening, you know who you are. Also, a fellow Liverpool fan, come into class and, tell me Brendan Rodgers is Dunzo, which was good. But then immediately the next question is, well, who's going to replace him? Flash forward about a week later, same student comes into class and says, we got Klopp. And I remember telling that student, the first words coming out of my mouth were, okay, well, we now put our faith in rock and roll Jesus. Right. It's hard to really explain, particularly for non-Liverpool fans, what the state of the club, what the state of the fan base, what the state of your own personal psyche was like in the fall of 2015. Uh, Late stage Brendan Rodgers was rancid, right? Collectively, we were all deflated from the title race that wasn't in 2013, 2014. Suarez left. Raheem Sterling, who, remember, he was a homegrown, he's a local kid. He forced his way out. So, players are leaving. The incoming players, man, I mean, Balotelli, Benteke. I know we brought Bobby in that summer of 2014, but Rogers didn't know what to do with him. He's playing him like out left or out right. Uh, it was bad. And to be fair, it had been bad for a while. Right. You know, pre-club, we were in a very real sense history FC. Right. I started, following the club in the mid 90s. So like 97, I want to say, the Michael Owen era. Uh, we had Istanbul. We had some domestic cup finals, but that was really all we had. I mean, my coming of age in English football was the era of Ferguson and Ferguson's United, sometimes Arsene Wenger's Arsenal, then later sometimes, Mourinho or whatever mercenary, Roman Abramovich hired Chelsea. Uh, and then certainly by that point, the beginning of what would be the, Man City steamroller. We were a club with a history, with a tradition, but really we were living in the past. We were sad. It was glory days syndrome. And it was a built-in kind of nihilism, which occasionally still comes out, if you've been paying attention to what I've had to say over the years on the pod, right? There was this institutional nihilism within the fan base because once something started going well, it was like, okay, well, when is the shoe going to fall off? When are we going to turn into a freaking pumpkin again? So, look, I had seen many a manager in and out, when I was young and I guess less cynical, during the Houllier era and the Benitez era, I would believe, but then you'd be disappointed. So I was excited when they hired Jurgen, but I had that built-in sort of cynicism and skepticism. But I remember his opening press conference, and I remember being highly impressed. I mean, the whole "I am the normal one" uh, played well with the fan base, and a little bit more about that in a second, in terms of his place amongst the fans. But he said, "I'll never forget this. We're going to win trophies in the next 4 years." And I said, "Okay, we'll see, we'll see," because the state of the club at the time, I mean, we were a mess. We were an absolute mess. I think the most important thing in terms of what Klopp did, and again, in terms of his legacy, and a little bit more about this, we talk about his legacy in regards to the club, was that he brought belief back. And to be fair, like the belief had been gone for a while. And it wasn't just words, it wasn't just, we're going to win trophies in the next 4 years. That Europa League run, which included that crazy comeback at Anfield against Dortmund, that's when I first started believing. That was that match against Dortmund. That was the birth of the quote unquote mentality monsters. Uh, right, because part of why the Brendan Rodgers era towards the end was so disgusting was no one cared. People just stopped believing. The players, the fans, everyone stopped believing. We started believing again. And let's be real, even though they lost that Europa League final to Sevilla, which, by the way, if you lose the Europa League final to Sevilla, that's fine. We had no business being in that final. Let's be real. That team was, if you look at that starting 11 that played in that final, we had no business being there. The following season, we do all right, right? We had a pretty good transfer window. Sadio Mane, who I saw at Southampton and was, thoroughly impressed, came. And that was, I think in retrospect, that's probably one of the first of several transformative transfers. But right, we brought in Joel Matip, who I didn't really know much about, from Hoffenheim, and Gini Wijnaldum, who was just some Dutch guy who played on a really bad Newcastle team. We did all right that season, but the 2017-2018 season, when we brought in Mo, we brought in Van Dijk, we promoted Trent Gomez. We brought in Robbo, who again, talk about a guy who, is like, oh, that Scottish guy from Hull. What interesting. That that's really when I was like, okay. Because after that UCL final, which we lost, which we could have won, by the way, if it wasn't for, uh sabotage, by a Spanish center back and by a, German goalkeeper, who will go unnamed. That's when I said I remember talking to that same student that I had in class several years before, and I was like, next year we're going to win something. I don't know what we're going to win, but we're going to win something. And indeed we did. Champions League final, 2018, 2019, won the league after 30 years, 2019, 2020. And I would say from 2018, even January 2018, right? Because people forget, for me, one of the seminal moments wasn't even just beating Man City in the Champions League, which we did. It was that match at Anfield where we absolutely in the second half put them on toast. From about January 2018 to the summer of 2020, we were arguably the best club in world football, which, again, for a Liverpool fan of my age who didn't really have a frame of reference from the 70s, the 80s, who has this built in sort of nihilism, that was incredible. And again, not just winning the Champions League, because we'd seen that before. Istanbul. We'd been to Champions League finals, even in that 30-year run of pain. Being the first Liverpool manager to win the Premier League after 30 years winning a title, I should say, ensures his place. Could it have been more? Right? Because he does have one UCL, one Premier League, two near Premier Leagues, right? 97 points. Usually, in most other seasons going up against most other clubs, 97 points means you walk the league. We finished second because, Pep is real. Pep and an oil rig live. Yeah, it could have been. Uh, and part of that, I think, is on club. Uh, So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the positives, right? Now that I've given you sort of the background, the story, uh, but also some of the negatives of the club era. So, in terms of positives, the reason I gave you all that background information was important. You need to look at where the club was to where it is now, today, in order to judge his impact. And let's be real, we were a freaking disaster. 2013, 2014, the Suarez season was fun, but that was artificial. Even during that title run, I was like, we have no defense. How is this going to work? And it didn't work. There was no belief. The club was a mess. By the time you flash forward to again, that period from 2018 to 2020, it's night and day. The belief was there from the club, from the fans. Night and day. A transformative figure in the history of our club, without a doubt. Another positive is, and we sort of knew this when we were getting him from Dortmund, was his reputation with taking rather ordinary players or good players and transforming ordinary players into good players and good players into great players. And I brought up Gini Wijnaldum. I remember when we bought Wijnaldum, and I was like, "This okay?" The guy from I said that guy from Newcastle. Klopp took a guy who really didn't have a position at Newcastle. He was sometimes a 10, sometimes played out wide, transformed him into, this is my opinion, one of the best number eights we have had at the club, and one of my all-time favorite Liverpool players. You know, his ability to hold on to the ball and, press simply, he's a wonderful fit. Klopp transformed him into a number eight. And again, those two goals in the second leg against Barcelona, again, but even Salah, like I was aware of Salah's existence, before we bought him. Geez, going back to the Algeria Egypt World Cup playoff, from 2013, I remember saying, wow, who is this Egyptian guy who's scoring goals? He was a good player at Rome. Pup transformed him into arguably, and we'll have this conversation, I'm sure, probably during the summer because I have a feeling this is his last dance too. Arguably one of the best players, period, of the Premier League era. I think we had that's the discussion. At least one of the best pure goal scorers. So his ability to transform players and also, give youth a chance, right? It's under Klopp that Trent gets brought up. Joe Gomez, who has had some, rough times, but he had a great year this year, was brought up. Harvey Elliott, Curtis Jones, etc. Freaking Keller. Another positive, and again, I don't know whether this, in some ways, maybe this is a perfect storm. It's chicken and an egg. I don't think there's ever been a manager who has best fit a culture in English football, or at least this era of English football, than Jurgen Klopp. Right? He understood the club, the culture, the fan base. And right, I go back to that initial press conference. I am the normal one, but also too a guy who walks into a club which its fan base is working class, genuinely left of center, quote unquote old labor, Jeremy Corbyn labor, and straight up says, "Yeah, I love Jesus, but I'm a Christian socialist." That's money. And right, he wore his emotions on his sleeve, and we are, for better or for worse, I think it's a double-edged sword, a very emotional fan base. And so, I mean, the fit in so many ways was perfect. And, his ability, more about this, because again, this could be a double-edged sword too, to, be rather honest. We were History FC. We had that sort of glory days mentality. And I remember in the lead up to the Champions League final in 2019, he said, the history is great, but we have to create history. We have to transform reality into myth. Which actually, if you think about that, is an extremely German way of looking at things. But it's true. This era created new myths, new heroes, new, traditions. On the negative side, right? Because if you look at what he achieved, he's pretty, other than the Europa League, which we probably should have won this year, but he's won every trophy he could. But the thing is, and people, opposition fans will come back at you or me and say, only one Premier League, even though in any other season we would have won it two more times. Just City's real. And only the one UCL, even though he did get us to three finals, but he only won one. Some of that was bad luck, right? I go back to City is real, and City with Pep Guardiola is a different beast, right? Because I've always said it's not just the money with City. They were spending money before. They won the league a couple times. They weren't this, dominant. It's that money and it's that manager. And look, the two Champions League finals we lost were to Real Madrid. And right, I go back to that first one. If Ramos doesn't do what he did in the first 10 minutes, and I don't know if a German goalkeeper who may or may not have been concussed did what he did, I think we might win that one. The second one, I mean, hey, Courtois had the match of his life. You can't really get pissed off about that. But could we have done more? Yeah, I think we could have. And right, I don't think that period from 2018 to 2020 was a flash in the pan. I just think that was our window. Uh, and that window probably could have been prolonged a little bit. Why and how does Klopp maybe play into that? Well, look, you guys have listened to me and watched me on this podcast over the last couple of years, And up until this summer, what do I kept saying? I love Klopp, but he can be loyal and loyal to a fault. Like that's one of his, you know, excellent qualities. Players want to play for him because of that. But sometimes you have to be a little bit more ruthless, particularly in terms of, aging players. How many times over the last couple of years before this last summer transfer window did I say things like, why is James Milner still in this team? And we have to replace Henderson, right? The fact that those two were still not just in the squad, but integral parts of the squad up until last year when their legs were just dead, you know, that's an issue, and I think back to those Ferguson United teams where he was ruthless. He was like, okay, you have 4 or 5 realistic years here, and then we're going to cycle you out because we have to keep it fresh and we also have to future proof the squad. And that's something that Klopp really didn't do a great job of. We didn't future proof during that window, and it came back to bite us in the ass. Uh Tactical inflexibility. Klopp has a bit of a reputation of being sort of technically naive. I think everyone would agree that he's, if not the best, one of the best man managers of this era, not just in England, but in world football. But tactically, mm, and that's been an issue. When he first came, we were playing 4-2-3-1, but a lot of that was because we had Felipe Coutinho, who is, if you designed a 10 in a laboratory, it would probably look like Felipe Coutinho. Once Coutinho left, we went to this, 4-3-3 with the holding man and a false nine. And look, that worked. When we had peak Fabinho and we had peak Mane, Salah, and then Bobby, that was fine. But when those guys stopped being peak, it got stale. It got less effective. And look, you could press all you want. Eventually, oppositional managers, because they're not scrubs, are going to tactically adjust to you. And it was the year after we won the league, even though we had all of those, injuries at center back. Uh More about that in a second, where that really, really was magnified because I was like, look, the teams are just going to a low block against us because they know that's our kryptonite. And Klopp needs to do something to change that. Well, I don't know that it took 2 years for him to finally change that. And that was the problem too. Like when things weren't working, rather than switching it up, a la like let's say a Rafa Benitez, because I mean that was Benitez's, one of his strengths, but also one of his curses. He looked at every individual opponent and said, "How can I, mad scientist this thing to keep them, guessing?" Well, Klopp wasn't great at that. And right, maybe this also runs back into the loyalty. Look, I think one of his best coaching jobs was actually that 2020, 2021 season when all of our center backs got hurt in the first like 2 months. Right. The fact that we finished third that year makes no sense. And that is literally, a testament to Klopp and the sort of mentality monsters because a lot of teams would have folded. The heads would have been down. But it needs to be said, we only started playing better that season when we actually had center backs, not particularly great center backs, but center backs, actually existing center backs playing center back. How many draws or losses did we take that year because Klopp was either like weirdly loyal to certain guys or weirdly just inflexible and was like, no, I'm going to play Fabinho out of position. I'm going to play. We had Jordan Henderson started 8 matches at center back then. That makes no sense, right? So this loyalty to a fault to certain players, a bit of a tactical inflexibility, And something which I've been sort of hinting at the pod, but really has, I think, come to light over the course of the last couple of weeks, issues with the board. And look, not that, he's difficult to work with, etc., but when we look back at the Klopp era, and particularly that dominant, like 2.5 year stretch, the names Julian Ward and Michael Edwards have to also be mentioned, right? These are the guys who we talk about, these okay players or good players that Klopp turned into great players. These are the guys that got those players in. And right, remember, like Salah, Klopp wanted Julian Brandt. It was Michael Edwards who's like, no, I know this Egyptian guy who we could get for cheaper and will fit your system better than homeboy will. And right, the rest was history. The last couple transfer windows, particularly this last one, which wasn't a total disaster, right? I mean, McAllister, probably the signing of the season, especially in terms of how much we paid, which was like nothing. And look, I think Sabazalai, Gravenberch, I think these guys are going to come good. And Endo is just Endo. Uh, but the whole Caicedo like mess, like the last two transfer windows, really the last four, if you include the winter ones, have been kind of all over the place. And a lot of that is the other reason for that is when Klopp signed that new contract, he was given a lot more power. And the likes of Michael Edwards, Julian Ward, they bounced, like they left. Right, because rather than having a negotiation with the manager, it was the manager who can't scout everybody on the planet, right? Vetoing the scouting, the back room, the board effectively, and which is why we had Klopp's drinking buddy Jurgen Schmatke as an interim director of football. Well, Klopp's leaving now, and who's come back into the fold? Well, Michael Edwards, Julian Ward, all these guys are coming back in, and it's like, why is that? So look, that 2.5 year period was awesome. I mean, I'll stand by this. We were the best team in world football. But could could we have extended that window? Could we have done a refresh, a rebuild a lot earlier? Could we have been more tactically astute or unpredictable? Hell yeah, we could have. Let's talk about legacy. And I want to talk about his legacy within the club first, and then in the Premier League in general. Where does Klopp rank, and how should he be remembered in regards to Liverpool's history and in terms of the Champions League? Excuse me, the Premier League itself. So, in terms of Liverpool, look, his legacy is secure. He is a club legend. If there's a Mount Rushmore of Liverpool managers, it's Shankly, it's Bob Paisley, it's probably King Kenny, and then it's Klopp. Winning our first league title in 30 years alone guarantees him a spot there. And like I said, you have to kind of judge him in terms of where the club was before he got there and where the club is now. And look, he changed everything. He changed the culture. He transformative figure. He's clear of guys like Benitez and Houllier, etc. But on that Mount Rushmore, I think he is clearly fourth. And the reason for that is now this can change. I'll talk about this in a second. Shankly, in a very real way, the club that predated him, in a very real way, created Liverpool. He birthed what we know as Liverpool. Bob Paisley, in my estimation, is the best English, not British, right? For he was Scottish, so but the best English manager ever. And look, under King Kenny's watch, we owned England for about 8 years. We kind of just won everything. Klopp, unfortunately, does not have the trophies. Or in the case of Shankly, I'd argue the the transformative ethos that those three had, nor the sustained success. Because that's the thing too. Klopp was here. I mean, maybe collectively it's about the same as Kenny, but I think Kenny's first stint was only 6 or 7 seasons, so less than Klopp. He didn't have the sustained success that those guys had. That being said, I'm willing maybe in 2, 3, 4, 5 years to come back and reevaluate this, in so much that I think Klopp potentially could go down as having a similar legacy as Shankly, which is saying a lot. But hear me out. Both of them were transformative figures at the club. Shankly birthed us, Klopp revived us. Rock and roll Jesus, resurrection. But with Shankly built the foundations, very strong foundations that he turned over to Bob Paisley. And under Paisley, we conquered the world. Klopp is leaving, but he is leaving pretty good foundation, right? We have arguably the best goalkeeper in the world. Uh, I don't know if he's necessarily the best center back in world football anymore, but he's one of the best center backs in world football anymore. A really exciting young midfield and a young core, right? We'll see what happens in the summer with the forwards, but this is Arne Slot, assuming that he is going to be the next manager, is taking over a pretty good team. There's things that need to be sorted out. The future of some of the forwards, bringing in new forwards, the defense, getting younger. But if he can take this foundation that Klopp built, and maybe I don't know, Pep decides that he's done with farming what has become a farmers league. Arne Slot wins a league title, we win another Champions League, etc. Then maybe the conversation about where Klopp ranks changes, and maybe he leapfrogs, Kenny. Uh, but regardless, he is a Liverpool legend. His legacy is secure. I know this season's been weird, although I think it's actually in a weird way going to wind up in terms of what we achieved and where we are in the league standings to be about where I thought we'd be, third place in the trophy. I said that at the beginning of the season. His it's almost like what happens on Sunday doesn't matter for us. Obviously, we want to win because we want to have a party. Uh, but his legacy is secure. When it comes to the totality of, and I'm going to pull a Mike Shoestack here, right? So we're talking about the Premier League. It's a little different. Uh, Look, I think Ferguson and Pep are clear of well. I'm not delusional. And the reason I say that is they have more trophies, and that isn't the be all end all, but it matters, right? You play to win the game. And the fact that the two of them have had periods of absolutely sustained dominance with a different set of characters, right? Some of the warts of the Klopp era, the inflexibility, the loyalty almost to a fault. Those two, if they think you're done, they'll cycle you out, and they'll cycle you out a year before you're done, right? So you're not having the where did Fabinho's legs go conversation. In terms of where he fit ranks and where he fits, I'd say he's comparable to Arsene Wenger. Now, Arsenal fans, Coach G will hear this and like come to my house and you know threaten me. I don't know. Arsenal fans can say, okay, Wenger won more leagues, and he did. Let's be real. Klopp has one. Vice versa, I would throw at Arsenal fans. What did your boy do in Europe? Oh, okay. So Klopp, I think that evens out. But the reason I sort of link him with Wenger is because Wenger did not win as much as Ferguson did. Facts. But in some ways, he was more transformative, and in some ways, maybe more important, right? And this is my historian brain here, than, Ferguson was. Wenger changed English football. He brought in sports science. He brought in, new training methods. He told players, look, you can't just smoke like 2 packs of cigs and drink mad beer because this isn't how we do modern football. And one of the reasons, Ferguson's teams were so successful and, but later the Chelsea teams, etc., was because those managers and those clubs embraced these modern ideas. Arsene Wenger changed English football, revolutionized it. I would argue, and I think I've said this sort of, maybe not in these terms on the podcast, the Klopp effect. Before 2015, there were 3, maybe 4 teams in English football that pressed, and no one was getting pressing, right? Because that was just some weird shit that German teams did. We don't do this thing. Klopp comes, and if you look at the league now, there's not 2 or 3 teams. There's only like 2 or 3 teams that don't press, right? Uh, Even guys like Sean Dyche have embraced, at least partially, this sort of oppressing Jurgen Klopp type of football. He doesn't. That's not his system. He's still Mr. Low Block, but he's at least incorporated parts of these tactics. Uh and going back to how this has transformed things. Look, Pep Guardiola's City have been the most dominant force in not just England but world football during the same time, exactly during the Klopp era or most of it. But he's not doing this playing old school Barcelona Pep tiki taka. Like that's not it anymore. He has embraced this more attacking, more front forward, elements of the gang press. And it's not just, the pressing, it's, what you're expecting of certain players. Like the reason that German guy, which is hysterical because his distribution that day sucked, uh, was in goal in that Champions League final in 2018 was because it was Klopp who said, you, your goalkeeper just can't be a shot stopper. They have to be good on the ball. They have to be good in possession. and and that is a marker now of what it means to be a good or competent modern goalkeeper. You can't just be a shot stopper anymore. You have to be able to play out the back. You have to be able to distribute the ball, right? So what I this much like Wenger in terms of adopting modern methods in terms of sports science, training, diet, etc. I think Klopp has had a similar impact on how the British game has changed, the English game has changed, because, you know, barely anyone was pressing and barely anyone would have, as a key criteria of their goalkeeper, you have to, be good in possession and distribution. No one in England was doing that in 2015. Flash forward almost 10 years, and practically no one is not doing that, or at least taking aspects of that into consideration. So Klopp revolutionized Liverpool, but he also revolutionized the English game. And that's why I would have him in that same kind of bracket as Arsene Wenger, right? Didn't win as many domestic trophies, but, Europe also has to be taken into consideration. And look, the two of them in some, we will all remember Ferguson, and we all remember Ferguson, and we're all going to remember Pep. But in some ways, Wenger and I would argue Klopp are equally, if not more important, not necessarily better, but important in terms of the history of the game and the development of the game. So that's it. Looking forward to Sunday. Like I said, I don't think the result really matters in terms of the longue durée, but we want to win. Let's have a party. Let's celebrate. Uh, and yeah, this is Professor Matt for the Too Many Guys Soccer Show. And look out for, the first of my sort of longer historically based pieces for the Euros should be coming out very soon. And hopefully we're all going to be, back in the saddle sometime in the next week or so. So enjoy the final match day in England. And you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. Peace it, friends.